Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first episode of the General Misconduct podcast. Before we get into today's episode, I'm going to lay the foundation and the ground rules for how this podcast is going to go and how future episodes are going to go. So if you've been following this project for any length of time, you know that what I plan on covering is the good, the bad, and the ugly of the General Officer Corps throughout history, focusing mainly on the period from the Revolutionary War up into today, and mainly focusing on American generals just because that's mostly what the audience is going to be familiar with. It's mostly what I'm familiar with, but I'll be touching on some foreign leaders too. This is going to be some stuffy audio biography podcast about these guys. I'm going to try to keep it lighthearted, keep it interesting, really try to uncover more about who these guys were as general officers, and try to paint you a better picture than what is often portrayed in history books and popular knowledge about these guys. A couple of these characters we're going to talk about have kind of been over-glamorized by history, especially today's character. So I kind of want to give more the paint you a better picture of who these guys were, specifically as general officers. We'll be going over some of their early life and stuff like that, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, and I'm going to brush over a lot of their military career prior to them becoming general officers, just because that's what I want to focus on. And if you've been following this project for any length of time, then you already know who today's character or subject matter is. It's Douglass MacArthur, probably the most famous general in U.S. history behind George Washington, and then you could argue Grant and Lee. But he's probably the most famous of any U.S. general, at least of the 20th century. And he's also he's unique in the fact that and we'll talk about just like how lengthy his career was, he serves longer as a general officer than any soldier in U.S. history up until that point. I don't think he's been surpassed since. And we'll get into that in a lot more detail. But to start with Doug MacArthur and who he was as a man, we have to look at his dad. And eventually one day I want to do a whole episode on his dad, Arthur MacArthur, because he in of himself has a whole military career that is worthy of a 4-hour podcast. And I'm just going to touch briefly on that. Just I'm going to give you some kind of the foundation of like how Doug was inspired to eventually serve his country. So, Arthur MacArthur. He's the son of a Scottish immigrant who served as a lieutenant governor and a circuit court judge in the state of Wisconsin. And when he is 17 years old, the Civil War breaks out. Now, at the time, it wouldn't be uncommon for somebody like Arthur at the age of 17 to become an officer in the U.S. Army. You have to understand that prior to the Civil War, the U.S. Army was tiny. Never numbered more than 100,000 men outside of times of conflict. That's going to be something that follows the Civil War is going to be true as well. But Arthur was the son of a politician and a very influential one in the state of Wisconsin. So when the war begins and all of a sudden the Army has this influx in numbers, you need an influx of officers too. And Arthur is a natural-born leader. His dad has connections, so he gets him the position of first lieutenant in the 24th Wisconsin Infantry at the age of 17. So Arthur goes off to war. He serves in the Western Theater, so he serves throughout Kentucky and Tennessee. And at the Battle of Missionary Ridge during the Siege of Chattanooga in 1863, he was 18 years old and he had already achieved the rank of captain. So imagine like that, if you served in the military, imagine like a private being your company commander. But he certainly earned that rank, though, because at the Battle of Missionary Ridge at the Siege of Chattanooga, he famously took the colors of his regiment and charged up the hill kind of by himself and led his regiment up a hill and really played a key part in the winning of that battle for the Union. And eventually he's going to receive the Medal of Honor for this, but it's not going to be for another 30 years after the end of the Civil War. Now, at the end of the Civil War, unlike most Civil War veterans, Arthur stays in the Army. You have to understand, at the end of the Civil War, a lot of guys were draftees, a lot of them were volunteers, but they were only going to serve for the length of the Civil War. The U.S. Army goes back to its original size following the end. It goes from, like, I don't have the official numbers in front of me, but it's an army of millions down to an army of, like, less than 100,000. But like I said, Arthur stays in. He serves in a variety of roles throughout the American frontier. And during his service, following the Civil War, is when he settles down and he starts his family. And he has 3 sons. The oldest being Arthur III. Second would be Malcolm. And then, of course, the one we all know, Doug. Now, when Malcolm is 4 years old, he ends up passing away tragically. And Doug was 3 at the time. So right away, we can already see some of the kind of the developments of Douglas as a character from a very young age. Father's a successful Civil War veteran. Doug's the youngest. And at a very young age, he watches his older brother pass away. So that kind of gives you a little bit of background on how he's going to develop as a young man. But fast forwarding ahead to 1898, his dad is finally promoted to brigadier general at the outbreak of the Spanish-American War. Arthur ends up being put in charge of the pacification of the Philippines. So, for those of you who don't know, the Spanish-American War was kind of a globe-spanning war. It was basically the remnants of what was left of the Spanish colonial empire basically collapsing, and the U.S. took full advantage of it. We took Puerto Rico, Cuba, and then in the Far East, we took the Philippines. And in the Philippines, this is actually one of the first, big cases of U.S. counterinsurgency overseas. And funny enough, or kind of foreshadowing, this is the first U.S. counterinsurgency against a primarily Muslim insurgent group. And Arthur MacArthur is the one who's put in charge of that. Now, so that's kind of also foreshadowing for Doug because, as many of you know, Doug eventually serves in the Philippines. And this is kind of where that, what should I say? Kind of that background is why Doug eventually serves in the Philippines is because going all the way back to 1898, his dad served in that role there. And that's kind of why he ends up in the Philippines later in his career. Now, Doug's brother at the time actually served in the war, not alongside his father. He actually goes into the Navy. His brother graduated from the Naval Academy right before the outbreak and ended up fighting in the war. Doug, of course, at the time was still too young to actually serve. But by 1899, after several attempts, he makes it into West Point, and he goes to college with his mother by his side. One of the important things to note is that, and this is going to come into play later in Doug's career, Doug is very much a mommy's boy, and it makes sense because his mother Mary watched her middle son die when he was 4, so she's very protective of Douglas. So she goes with him to West Point. His father is still serving in different capacities with the Army, and by this time, his father is a widely known man throughout the Army. He's a Medal of Honor recipient. He's a general. He's pretty much in charge of the entire counterinsurgency campaign in the Philippines. So by the time Doug goes to West Point, he is notorious throughout the Army. And this makes Doug the target of a lot of hazing. And it didn't help that his mom was also on campus with him, and that was widely known. But that doesn't really end up hindering him all that much. By the end of his freshman year, he had finished at the top of his class, and he ends up ranking first academically that year, as well as his sophomore year and his senior year. And during his senior year, he's actually the top of the Cadet Corps chain of command. and graduates at the top of his class in 1903, which is to be expected about, if we're talking about somebody who's going to be one of the first 5-star generals in U.S. history, it would make sense that he led his class 3 out of 4 years he was at university. He also played on the Army baseball team, and he was the student manager for the Army football team. So in 1903, he ends up graduating, like I said, at the top of his class, and he takes up his first assignment, which is going to be with the Army Corps of Engineers. And funny enough, and you could maybe say it was nepotism or something like that, he ends up getting sent to the Philippines, where his dad is still kind of not so much doing the counterinsurgency thing anymore. By 1903, that's kind of died down a bit. The pacification campaign had gone very well for Arthur. But basically, he kind of pulls some strings and he gets Doug sent over to the Philippines. An important side note to make is that while he's there on his first assignment to the Philippines as a lieutenant, he befriends a guy by the name of Manuel Quezon. Now, if you're not familiar with that name, he is the guy who is going to serve as the president of the Philippines right before the invasion by the Japanese in World War II. So this is somebody that MacArthur in 30 plus years is going to have to work very close with. And we're kind of seeing the seeds already being planted of that friendship and what it's eventually going to lead to. And what it's really going to lead to is that Doug is going to eventually become kind of the de facto military dictator of the Philippines in the 1930s. We'll see how that goes later on down the line. But anyway, so after he's finished with his first post there in the Philippines, his second post is as chief engineer. Now, remember, he's still kind of a junior military officer at this point. But he serves as chief engineer under his father's command in the Department of California and became his aide de camp during a tour of the Far East. And at the same time that this happens, his father is promoted to lieutenant general, which at the time, 3-star general was the highest rank that you could attain in the U.S. military. Now, the highest position would be chief of staff, and that came with a temporary 4-star. I believe it was. I believe at the time they were implementing that rule, but that was the only other thing that would have been above that rank at the time. So he serves under his father, and his dad around this time, towards the end of Doug's second post, ends up retiring as the highest ranking man in the entire U.S. military, which one day Doug will become. And during that time that he served under his dad, he really benefited from making a lot of different connections in the military. You imagine you're a young captain in the U.S. Army and your dad's the highest ranking guy. You're going to meet a lot of guys who are going to be above you but below your dad, who are going to stay in after your dad retires, who you're going to need to know later in life. So that really ends up helping Doug's career development. So after his dad retires, Douglas ends up going to Fort Leavenworth as part of the... he takes up a command of a training unit there. And he ends up becoming kind of a pretty big star there at Fort Leavenworth. He made a lot of different reforms, new training methods that ended up making him kind of the biggest character there at the fort. And that's going to be something we're going to see with Doug later when he takes up the superintendent position at West Point, which we'll talk about here soon. He's very keen on military reforms. You have to understand that this is a pre-World War I Army, and the U.S. hasn't had a major engagement really since the Civil War. Now, like I said, we just had the Spanish-American War, but that doesn't really change a lot about how the armies ran. And Doug's going to see this as an opportunity for him to kind of rise up the ranks. Then, in 1917, in April, the U.S. enters World War I, and this is a big moment for Doug. He's been in the Army now for just about, 14 years when the war breaks out. And as soon as it breaks out, he's made chief of staff of the 42nd Infantry Division that had newly been made.